President Trump announced new sanctions against Turkey yesterday after the country began an invasion into northeast Syria. Those sanctions come on the heels of a UNICEF report that nearly 70,000 children have been displaced already in northeast Syria in 1 week alone. Michael Brooks wrote in a recent Jacobin piece that the U.S. withdrawal from Syria not only acted against the cause of peace, it will also lead to the eradication of the Kurds' democratic government and social progress.
Michael Brooks joins us now via Skype to explain more. Welcome, Michael. Hey,
good morning, Crystal. Great to be speaking with you.
It's great to have you. You argued in this piece that while the U.S. doesn't generally have legitimate foreign policy interests around the globe, this might be an exception in your view. Could you explain a little bit more about why you think that?
Well, yeah, I think what's really important here is the fact that through a sort of historical irony and inconsistency, you had a situation where the United States was backing and partnering with these Kurdish forces in northern Syria that happened to be the strongest fighting force against ISIS. That's the U.S. Primary concern, or at least it was. Now, it just so happens that in addition to protecting a very repressed group that has been on the receiving end in Turkey, in Iraq, and really across the Middle East, almost like a kind of internal imperialism or colonialism in the Middle East, these Kurdish forces have actually generated some real progressive, socialistic, in fact, experiments in governance. Now, are they perfect? Obviously not. No one is. But from the perspective of democratic governance, social openness, these forces are the most kind of left and interesting in the Middle East. And you had this interesting partnership there that U.S. forces remaining where they actually already were. It wasn't a long-term solution. There needed to be a broader strategic and diplomatic agreement. But as it was protecting a community and a very noble experiment.
Just talk a little bit more about what that experiment was and what it was based on. What was the philosophy inspired by?
Well, it's really funny. I mean, the leader, Öcalan, who's a prisoner in Turkey of a group called the PKK, which I would say the Kurds in northern Syria are connected to. They're not exactly the same thing, although Turkey would certainly assert that they are. But he, from prison, started reading a guy that I think basically had arguments with Bernie Sanders back in Burlington in the 80s, which is kind of funny. This Brooklyn socialist intellectual named Murray Bookchin, who wrote these books on eco-anarchism. And Öcalan read that and sort of directed his cadres and his organization in that direction. So what you have here is you have things that you might see out of old like town meeting models in New England. There's a lot of cooperative decision making. There's very strong empowerment of women. There's specific women fighter units, which they got a huge amount of PR buzz off of. There's ecological protection programs, and relatively speaking, compared to other areas of the fighting, there is a certain preservation of pluralism in these areas. There's obviously religious openness and some really tough rules on even things like domestic abuse.
So President Trump obviously ran on an America First platform. He promised his base that we were going to get out of engagements around the world as long as there was no real direct U.S. interest, right? So his promise to his voters was, we're only going to involve our military, our treasure, and our lives, and put our lives on the line when there's a direct U.S. interest. What do you see as a direct U.S. interest here under those definitions, or do you not, and you see this more as a humanitarian intervention or an intervention to protect an experiment that the Kurds are performing in their own region?
It's important that it's not an intervention in the sense that we're not talking about a future potential that we're averting by deploying U.S. troops. We're talking about something that already exists and needs to be handled intelligently, right? So I'm not a fan or a supporter of humanitarian intervention at all. I'm a big critic of Samantha Power as an example. But in terms of practical reality, this arrangement is about the only positive effect of our engagement in Syria more broadly. And if the Trump administration had any seriousness about this, which clearly it doesn't, they would have already They would have basically tried to support what is actually happening as a practical result right now because of the crisis we're in, which is actually recognize that, look, Assad is absolutely a war criminal, no doubt, but he's also maintained power and won. And the Kurds are going to need to see if there's a diplomatic rapprochement with him that is possible. That's actually what's happening. So they could have engaged in a serious diplomatic process. I think more broadly, though, yes, it does affect U.S. security. There's ISIS prisoners that are in play. The Turks are greatly destabilizing the region. That has big implications on Europe. And then I have to say, I just never, I'm not an isolationist. I'm interested in some type of global left solidarity, no doubt. But when Trump talks like this about ending endless wars and all this sort of thing, if only it were so. This guy is deploying additional troops to Saudi at the same week that he's pulling out on a really important ally and, in fact, jeopardizing an important experiment. So it's done in a haphazard and stupid way, which is a threat in a conventional sense. It's done in an immoral and wrong way, which we should all strongly object to. And even in his own terms, I'm not buying it. Civilian casualties are on the uptick, and he's deploying troops to Saudi. So this is not real drawdown at all. It's just his own haphazard way of doing the same old U.S. interventionism.
Yeah. I mean, how has the anti-imperialist left in general responded to this move by Trump? Because he does frame it in this terminology of let's end let's get out of the endless wars, which has a certain appeal. But then the details also really matter here.
The details matter tremendously. I mean, I think there's definitely a debate in the left, and I think some of it really does come down to, look, you can recognize that the United States global presence is the most powerful in the world today. And certainly when we're talking about Latin America or the Caribbean or so on, it plays an enormously harmful role. But there's also other regional hegemonic actors, in this case, Turkey. I mean, Turkey has an incredibly vicious history towards the Kurds. There's no doubt about it. And so I think that the real question is are you looking at a view that tries to calibrate these things and play them off each other and look at where we can actually support some emergence of third power, if that makes sense, outside of a conventional power politics. So whether that's the pink tide in Latin America or what's happening in Rojava, I think we have to support those things. And whether or not it's, Russia coalescing to, potentially support a progressive government in Latin America, or it's the United States that is in partnership with the Kurds, I think we have to be practical about it. So I think there's a big,
I was just going to say, turning to the politics of this a bit, which is another place where you have expertise, I mean, how's this all going to play out on the debate stage tonight? This is really the first debate where foreign policy can reasonably be expected to be front and center. Which candidates do you think are prepared to deal with that and which, frankly, aren't?
Bernie Sanders has put out strong statements on this. He also just put out a really strong statement on these incredible anti-IMF World Bank protests happening in Ecuador. I think he's the only campaign that is really thinking about what does a new phase of engagement actually look like in terms of post-conventional U.S. foreign policy. And I think, frankly, I appreciate what Tulsi will say about war, but I think that this might be an area where she will show some of her limitations in terms of solidarity. However, she will rightly say that some of the stuff we hear from Washington is crocodile tears because there should have been a much more serious diplomatic process earlier. And, diplomatic processes usually involve making deals with multiple actors that have blood on their hands, right? That's just kind of the nature of the world. It's depressing, it's unpleasant, but that it is what it is.
All right, Michael.
Everybody else will have nothing to say. Yeah. I'll just say that.
Bottom line. Michael, thank you so much. Yeah. Good to see you, friend.
Thank you guys so much.
Next up on Rising, the Gravalanche is back. Sagar spoke with former Alaska Senator Mike Gravel about his endorsements of Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard and Senator Bernie Sanders and who he thinks should drop out of the race.
Their conversation when Rising returns.